What limits the global extraction of wind power? The most important limits are practical: money, land, and the difficulty of managing wind power's intermittency. But as wind power grows in importance, there's a prospect for it taking a significant fraction of global primary energy supply. And it's relevant to ask, what are the geophysical limits to wind power extraction? Suppose a wind turbine stands alone on a wind power site. One cannot, of course, put another turbine directly behind it, because that second turbine would be in the slow wind shadow of the first. But imagine that one spaces turbines evenly across the whole site. As one adds additional turbines, the amount of power you get from each new turbine will be less than the previous, because the collective effects of all the turbines will be to slow the winds over the site. At some point, the total amount of power produced will saturate and then decline as one adds more turbines. Estimates of global wind power capacity traditionally handled this by simple rules of thumb derived from small commercial installations. The rule of thumb being that you couldn't space wind turbines more than about 10 rotor diameters apart. In practice, this translated to a limit on power production of a few watts per square meter of land surface. Then, estimates of the global capacity simply summed up local winds using these rules of thumb. But of course, this implicitly assumed that wind power extraction in one place did not affect wind power extraction in distant sites. In 2004, I co-authored a paper that examined the large-scale impacts of wind power on climate. And as part of that work, we noticed that large-scale thermodynamic effects really limited the amount of wind power that could be extracted. But that paper used a relatively primitive parameterization of wind turbines. In this paper, Amanda Adams and I have used a much more sophisticated parameterization embedded in a modern mesoscale climate model that can look at much finer resolution and therefore look meaningfully at smaller wind turbine arrays. Using two different boundary layer parameterizations and several different wind turbine array sizes, we found that the amount of wind power that could be extracted saturated at roughly 1 watt per square meter. While our paper was under review, two new papers were published that abandoned the non-interference assumption and used modern climate models to calculate the maximum geophysical limit to wind power extraction, finding wind power global capacities well in excess of 100 terawatts. At first glance, it appears that the results of these new papers are at odds with the results presented here. But when we do a more careful apples-to-apples comparison, we find surprising agreement. Here, we overlay results from Jacobson on the results of the current study. And here, we add similar results from our 2004 study. Given that the totality of these results involves several different wind turbine parameterizations, 3 different climate models, and a variation in the size of wind farm arrays by more than a factor of 10,000, the similarity of results is remarkable. It suggests, but does not prove, that for typical wind speed regimes, large-scale extraction of wind power may in practice be limited to less than 1 watt per square meter, and that significant saturation effects may be expected at about half a watt per square meter. What is the upshot of these new results? The two new papers examining the geophysical limits to wind power both depend on the assumption that one is willing to cover all of the land or even all the land and ocean surface with wind turbines. A more policy-relevant question is, what is the wind capacity when one assumes that wind power production is limited by distance from energy demand, by competition for land, and by the quality of the wind resource, how windy it is? One might call this the policy-constrained wind power capacity. Previous estimates of the policy-constrained wind power capacity have derived numbers of order a few tens of terawatts. But those estimates implicitly assume that the local power production could go as high as several watts per square meter. If wind power extraction is in practice limited below 1 watt per square meter, then policy-constrained estimates of global wind power capacity may be substantially exaggerated, and actual capacities may be low enough to put a meaningful constraint on wind's share of global primary energy over the next half-century. But that's a guess. Answering this question will demand a new generation of studies that combine physical limits to wind power extraction with social and economic limits to wind power siting. And these studies will have to take account of wind power's climatic impacts.